So, good afternoon. Good afternoon to everybody. People who decided to listen to Maria and not watching football are people that should have a monument. But it is a really great pleasure and privilege to introduce this talk in the Institute. And Maria Lipman is not somebody that needs a special presentation, at least for the people around the Institute for Human Sciences. She has been a visiting fellow several times, and she's very well known for everybody who has been doing Russia or have been interested in Russia for the last 30 years at least. She has been editors basically of everything that you have read, starting with the 1990s when there was the major still big journals, and then going with Pro and Contra, and then working for years at Carnegie Endowment. Now she's very senior associate at the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasia Studies at George Washington University in Washington, and which is very important for anybody who is going to write a book about Russia or Eastern Europe. She's the person who is going to review your book for the Foreign Affairs magazine, of course, if we're going to be lucky to be reviewed there. But also I'm very happy with her being here because she's going to, as somebody who knows both media and history and the politics and how the debate has been changing for the last decades after the end of the Cold War, this memory and history wars that have been going. We're living in a moment in which basically people are destroying monuments all over. We believe that this was very much an East European preoccupation, and it appears that now it's happening everywhere. And the story is what you're putting as a monument. And before giving her the word, I'm going to remind you of an interesting visual kind of art construction that a Bulgarian painter and artist Lachezar Boyajiv did. So he took all these famous monuments of statesmen on horses in Europe, like Frederick the Great in Berlin. And he said, all these people are so controversial and we want to have a kind of a much more political version of history. So he took the horsemen and now he left only the horses on the monument. So from this point of view, kind of editing history is a big issue. And this is why talking about the memory and history wars in Russia, who are Russian national heroes and why. So this is what basically Maria is going to talk to us today. So much, please.
Ivan, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me back after I had to evacuate because of COVID in March last year. Great to be here and great to talk in this semi-live fashion, not exactly live, but still. So I will talk about the policy of monumental commemoration in Russia, or more simply about monuments to historical figures and events. This topic is important at least for two reasons, one domestic and another international and comparative. Domestic has to do with the post-Soviet nation building and its elements such as politics of history and politics of symbols. Monuments, of course, played a very important role in the Soviet nation building that was heavily centralized and controlled by the Communist Party ever since the Bolshevik Revolution. The Soviet pantheon of heroes with Lenin at its head was part of the communist ideological canon. And Lenin statues, of course, were ubiquitous. 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union, what does the post-communist Russian nation stand for? What is our new pantheon of heroes today? Who do we commemorate and revere in today's Russia? Looking from a comparative perspective, the topic of monuments appears to be highly relevant, and Ivan already mentioned why. Quite a few countries ranging from Eastern and Central Europe to the United States and South Africa have recently engaged in iconoclasms of sorts, tearing down statues deemed ideologically inappropriate or morally reprehensible from today's perspective. In Russia, however, we've had an opposite trend, that of a monument fever, with more and more new symbolically charged monuments erected since the collapse of the Soviet Union. In the past decade, the Russian states and state-aligned actors have vastly expanded their operation in the realm of ideas, symbols, and historical memory. In particular, hundreds of new statues have been erected on the government initiative. The Kremlin or Putin ideology is commonly characterized as conservatism, which of course is not a distinct term. The Kremlin is good at condemning the ideologically inappropriate. It has steadily promoted anti-Western and anti-liberal narrative. But while it seems anxious to inculcate an ideologically correct mindset, the official line remains inconcrete and blurred. The narrative of the Great Patriotic War, the way, of course, World War II is referred to in Russia, is a striking exception. This narrative is officially regulated by a growing number of history laws. What I'd like to emphasize is that for all the Kremlin's effort, conservatism in Russia is far from consensual. I don't mean the discord between the officialdom and the liberals who have been under pressure and persecution recently. I mean the differences among conservatives of various strains. And let me cite a fairly recent episode. Now, this, of course, is not a recent episode. This was 30 years ago. And back then, this image was on the front page of basically every newspaper in the world. On August 21, 1991, the statue of FELIKS DZERZHINSKY, the organizer of the Bolshevik Red Terror, was torn down by cheering crowds celebrating their victory over the communist putsch. Now, the empty space in the center of this square, in front of the KGB, now FSB building, this yellow building that you can see, it may be seen as a symbolic reminder of the moment when the Russian people took action for the sake of what they believed was the right choice for their country. So now it's empty. This is where FELIKS DZERZHINSKY used to be. Today, only a small minority in Russia would share this interpretation that of the symbolic meaning of this empty space. A majority likely doesn't care one way or another, but there are also ideological entrepreneurs who would want Dzerzhinsky back, physically as well as symbolically. Such initiatives have been repeatedly voiced in the past years, most recently in February this year. This latest initiative was not worded in straightforward communist or Stalinist terms. The initiators made a public statement that the statue should be brought back because, and I quote, it had become part of Moscow's historical and cultural landscape, end of quote. But the softened statement did not prevent a heated debate. A range of actors came up with alternative suggestions of who might become the square's new centerpiece. The candidates ranged from the 13th century Prince Alexander Nevsky to Yuri Andropov, who headed the KGB from late 1960s to early 1980s. Keeping the place empty was not among the suggestions. The debates continued for about 2 or 3 weeks and emphasized that the issue was anything but consensual. A simultaneous poll asking Muscovites who they would prefer to see commemorated in Lubyanka Square showed that the issue was also highly divisive at the grassroots level. In the end, the debate was wrapped up and the square today remains without a centerpiece. Observers agreed that what lied beneath the Dzerzhinsky debate was a political clash between groups in and close to the establishment. To me, the Dzerzhinsky controversy is important because of the way a public debate of an ideological or symbolic issue laid bare the existing, if dormant, differences both within the establishment and among the general public. In the rest of my talk, I will take you briefly back to the 20th century and the Soviet policy of monument building. I will then turn to the commemorative practices of the early post-Soviet Russia, the 1990s. And finally, I'll get to today's Russian pantheon as it is reflected in the newly erected statues and in the public mindset. Over the past 100 years, Russia's monumental commemoration has seen 3 spells of iconoclasm, of course, quote unquote, iconoclasm, when monuments were torn down. And also 2 flushes of monument fever, one of them, as I mentioned, unfolding after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, very soon after overthrowing the Ancien Régime in 1917, Lenin launched his plan of monumental propaganda. His decree ordered to remove monuments erected in honor of the czars and their servants and draft projects for monuments dedicated to the Russian Socialist Revolution. Lenin ordered that the ideologically wrong monuments, and that was the first iconoclasm, be torn down in 2 months' time. The deadline was not met, but a number of statues were still dismantled. Here you see the statue of Alexander III dismantled in Moscow, and this is the statue of Alexander II dismantled in Rostov-on-Don a bit later. Lenin's goal was to convert Russia's new citizens into the one and only true creed, that is Marxism-Leninism, and part of this conversion was creating a new pantheon. The list of figures to be venerated was put together by Lenin personally, together with a couple associates. It had 64 names, 62 men and 2 women. After Lenin's death in 1924, his own image became the main tool of monumental propaganda. The first statues began to appear literally overnight after the news of his death reached the nation. And that was, of course, a manifestation of a genuine and universal grassroots veneration of Lenin at the time. The statues or monuments came in different shapes, designs, and materials. But already in 1930s, Lenin's image became canonized and monopolized by the state. The communist pantheon thus acquired its primary hero, ubiquitous and universally recognizable. Stalin statues began to appear in early 1930s, at first as a Lenin associate. Now, here is one of the early canons, which has 2 leaders sitting side by side on the bench. Lenin dead but forever alive, and he is embracing Stalin, still alive but already immortalized. Stalin image very quickly became as ubiquitous as Lenin's was. Other Bolsheviks were commemorated much later. Throughout the Soviet period, all newly erected monuments, their form and substance, had to bear a stamp of approval by the Communist Party. The party thereby performed the function of the producer and guardian of the national pantheon. And the overall monumental propaganda campaign was fairly successful. In mid to late 1940s, monuments glorifying the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany and commemorating World War II heroes began to emerge. The scope of this commemoration grew much larger under Brezhnev after the 20th anniversary of the victory in 1965. So here is the largest, the most famous, the grandest memorial on MAMAEV Hill at the site of Stalingrad battle. Now, this trend reached gigantic proportions under Stalin's rule. In 1956, 3 years after Stalin's death, Khrushchev famously condemned Stalin's personality cult and mass repressions. And he did that in his secret speech at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party. The year, I repeat, was 1956. His speech encouraged spontaneous demolitions of Stalin's statues, but the government-ordered dismantling of Stalin's statues did not begin until 1961. That year, Stalin's relics or remains were secretly removed from the mausoleum and reburied behind it. This was also the year when Stalingrad was renamed Volgograd. A bust on Stalin's grave appeared 10 years later and remains there till this day. Here you see the leader of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation today, Gennady Zyuganov, laying wreaths on Stalin's grave. He does this every year, maybe not even once, but members of the Russian establishment, beginning with Putin, never do that. This is something that the Communist Party leadership does. The expulsion of Stalin from the national pantheon was arguably the most radical and broad-scale iconoclasm in the history of the mankind. Virtually all of the countless Stalin's monuments, images, and names were thoroughly erased. After that, and through the end of the Soviet Union, the national pantheon, as reflected in the commemorative statues, remained mostly unchanged. One major member added to the pantheon during the post-war period was Yuri Gagarin, the first Soviet astronaut, officially glorified and universally recognized by the Soviet people. A monument to Gagarin was erected in 1980. So we have now got very quickly to the end of the Soviet period. Into the third spell of iconoclasm, which began with overthrowing of Felix Dzerζhinsky that I mentioned earlier. Here's one more image, maybe even more powerful than the first one. The third iconoclasm, however, proved to be much more modest than the second one was. In particular, most Lenin statues remained in place. According to some estimates, there were 7,000 Lenins in the territory of Russia within the Soviet Union in 1991, and about 6,000 remain in place today. This does not mean that 1,000 was demolished. Actually, most of them just crumbled away with time. For comparison, in Ukraine, these numbers are 5,500 and 350 respectively. So those communist statues that were torn down were at first irreverently dumped in a park around the Moscow Art Gallery, later renamed the Garden of Sculptures. And in 1998, a Russian sculptor, Evgeny Chubarov, made a composition that he called Victims of Totalitarian Regime that was placed right next to the translocated monuments of that regime's leaders. So this monument shows 283 human heads carved of stone and piled behind bars in a massive concrete wall. The commemorative policy of the first post-Soviet decade may be described as the rectification of historical justice. A major example was a mountain monument to Georgy ZHUKOV, erected at the entrance to the Red Square. Now, the ZHUKOV statue was not an introduction of a new hero, far from it. It was a recognition of Zhukov's broadest national fame as a highly decorated grand commander of the Great Patriotic War, and in many ways, the mastermind of the Soviet victory. After the war, Zhukov's glory and universal popularity made both Stalin and Khrushchev apprehensive, and both leaders at various times disfavored Zhukov. So this Zhukov statue was initiated by Russia's first president, Boris Yeltsin, but in the 1990s, the state generally relinquished its role as the guardian of the national pantheon. Monuments of various figures and events that were deemed inappropriate or unworthy of commemoration under the communist regime began to appear in Moscow and elsewhere, built on private or local initiatives. A major example of delayed recognition was the monument to Vladimir Vysotsky, a very popular actor and bard who had enjoyed broadest popular admiration, even worship, and still was never fully, that is, officially celebrated as a figure of national fame. Many more Vysotsky statues are found these days across Russia. Throughout the 1990s, Russian regions and cities were rediscovering or reinventing their local histories and building their new identities and monuments. Most commonly, those local statues commemorated ancient princes or saints. Around the same time, in mid-1990s, Moscow Mayor Yuri Lushkov commissioned a gigantic statue of Peter the Great. Now, Peter the Great, or Peter the First, is by far the most famous Russian Tsar, and was by far the most famous Russian Tsar in the Soviet period. And he occupied a very important place in the Soviet popular historical narrative, as well as in literature and film. As a westernizing reformer and modernizer, Peter the Great looked to be an appropriate national symbol for the new Russia of 1990s. But this new statue failed to add a new meaning to the figure of Peter the Great or to incorporate him in the new Russian narrative. Besides, the statue promptly became the target of vicious criticism. It was deemed ugly, interfering with the Moscow landscape, which I think is hard to disagree with. An attempt to add a new figure to the post-Soviet pantheon was undertaken by the Union of Right-Wing Forces, a Russian liberal party. It commissioned a statue of the 19th century emperor, Alexander II, the liberator of peasants from serfdom. However, by the time the monument was finally erected, that party, the Union of Right-Wing Forces, has lost its popularity as well as its representation in the Duma. Alexander II did not become any more recognizable or recognized than he was before, and certainly he did not become a member of a new pantheon. Let me cite a few more instances just to give you an idea of what I mean by rectification of Soviet time injustice. What I will now quickly mention are all privately initiated and privately sponsored memorializations. Monument to soldiers killed in Afghanistan across Russia, a great deal of them, all of them privately sponsored. About 700 memorials of victims of mass repressions of various scopes and size, and the largest and most impressive among them, called the Mask of Sorrow, was built in Magadan in the Far East, of course, the territory where there were lots of labor camps. Now, quite a number of artistic and literary figures who were unwelcome and or fallen victim of Stalin's repressions were also commemorated on private and privately sponsored initiatives. And since the state no longer played the role of the ultimate authority of the politics of symbols and commemoration, this new freedom of expression gave rise to hundreds of light-hearted, ironic statues that would have been inconceivable in the Soviet regime. To give you an idea, this category of sculptured images includes, among scores and scores of others, a statue of mosquito, of a can of Sprouts, a hammer, a stool, a chair, a plumber, here's the plumber for you, a drunkard, a businesswoman, an apple, a cucumber, and a range of literary and film characters. Basically, every city in Russia, every town, I think, has something of this sort. Of course, again, inconceivable in the Soviet Union. Now, observing the Russian monument scene in 2010, at the end of that period, Alexei Makarkin, a prominent Russian political analyst, wrote, and here is a quote from him, the dominance of the state as a defining and centralizing power in questions of monumental propaganda became a thing of the past. And the quotation marks are his, Alexei Makarkin's, not mine. The past, however, returned much sooner than anyone would expect. So this quote is from, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. The year 2012, the quote is from 2010, marked a political watershed. Following mass anti-Putin protests of 2011 and 12, the Kremlin and Putin in particular intensified their operation in the ideological and symbolic realm. One of the manifestations of this ideological engagement was the establishment in 2012 of the Russian Military Historical Society. Very soon, the Military Historical Society launched what it unabashedly referred to as the program of monumental propaganda. About 250 new statues have been erected so far, so since 2012, basically, in fact, even 2013. So all under the auspices of the Russian Military Historical Society. Many of them, though not all, are war memorials and victory statues. The largest memorial park in Poklonnaya Gora in Moscow, dedicated to the 1945 victory, has become grander and grander, with more and more statues added to this complex every year. So after 3 spells of iconoclasm, following the Bolshevik Revolution, following the condemnation of Stalin by Khrushchev, and following the collapse of the Soviet Union, and after 1 episode of a monumental frenzy, also following Lenin's instructions, early after the Bolshevik Revolution, Russia has experienced a new relapse of state-sponsored monument fever. So Who are Russia's new heroes promoted by the state and parastate actors? And what is the impact of this new flush of monumental fever on the pantheon existing in the hearts and minds of today's Russians? I mentioned the failed attempt to make Emperor Alexander II the liberator of serfs, to make him a member of the new pantheon. In fact, every Russian pre-revolutionary ruler has been commemorated in stone or bronze in the past years. No czar has been left behind. Now, to give you an idea, the list is by far not exhaustive. So each has his own czar to adore. And we have, czars who are very prominent in Russian history, figures who are considered not even deserving a statue such as Ivan the Terrible, and sort of secondary tier czars, all have their own statues in various places in Russia, regardless of whether or not that particular czar or czarina has a bearing to that particular region. Thing is, however, that unlike the monumental propaganda of the Soviet times, the monumental commemoration of the Russian monarchs has not been followed by a dissemination of a corresponding narrative, one that would explain why we're celebrating this or that particular czar today, and thereby generate a broader recognition of that royal figure. Same is true if we look at the new statues whose opening ceremonies Putin attended personally. Now, here you have a list of a peculiar collection of figures. Highlighted in black, I think, are the Russian czars. And Putin, as you see, has attended the opening ceremonies of several of them. And that of Alexander III was, Putin deigned that opening ceremony even twice, once this year, 2021. So quite a few figures on this list, as you look at them, are strongly symbolically charged and could actually endow new meaning to the post-communist Russia if the government again bothered to accompany the monumental commemoration by other forms of commemoration and by disseminating a narrative. Of course, Stolypin is such a figure, prime minister, who is referred to as a conservative modernizer, conservative reformer, a figure that seems somehow in sync with Putin's own ideas, at least from a while before, as well as this collection of czars. And Putin's presence at the inauguration ceremonies might enhance the symbolic importance. But it didn't. Putin attended the opening ceremony of the Alexander III monument even twice, as I mentioned, but when asked in an interview who was his favorite czar, he never mentioned Alexander III. He actually mentioned Peter the Great as his favorite czar, just as most Russians would. Putin attended the Wall of Sorrow, a memorial of the victims of Stalin's repressions. Again, a very powerful symbol, even if the memorial itself is not very attractive aesthetically, but nevertheless, this seems like a powerful symbol. Still, it was not followed by a consistent narrative. Putin also attended this opening ceremony of Solzhenitsyn's statue. Solzhenitsyn does not enjoy universal fame in Russia, and his fame did not grow after Putin attended the inauguration ceremony. Now, Putin also attended the inauguration ceremony of the monument to St. Vladimir, the 10th century prince, of course, who Christianized Kiev and Rus. This is an interesting example. The implication of having St. Vladimir statue in the Russian capital, of course, is political rather than religious. After the annexation of Crimea and the ensuing hostility between Russia and Ukraine, Kiev became inappropriate as the site of the Christianization of Rus. So it was impossible to relocate the Christianization to Moscow because Moscow did not exist at that time, did not yet exist at that time. The Kremlin has instead relocated St. Vladimir himself and thus sort of appropriated him. But again, none of those historical episodes, I mean, the episodes that are related to the figures commemorated and when the opening ceremony was attended by Putin, none was accompanied by a distinct, yet alone persistent public narrative. Despite Putin's consistent engagement in the ideological sphere of the past decade, he has not contributed to the shaping of a post-Soviet national pantheon. Now, the figure of Stalin and Stalin monuments deserve special mention. Many dozens of Stalin busts. This one is in Lipetsk, and as you see, it's been vandalized. This is not the case with most others. So these busts, dozens, many dozens of them, have appeared in various Russian localities during Putin's tenure. All of them are relatively small scale. They are private initiatives, usually commissioned by local chapters of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, not by the government, but neither has the government gotten in the way of such initiatives. Mourning Stalin's victims is part of the official policy. Putin, after all, initiated and attended the opening ceremony of the Wall of Sorrow. The Russian Orthodox Church has played a large part in the mourning of victims and even canonized some of the executed clerical figures as saint martyrs. Meanwhile, mnemonic actors and ideological entrepreneurs have glorified the executioners, such as Stalin, or advocate bringing back DZERZHINSKY. Monuments of Lenin still remain by far the most numerous and recognizable, but Lenin almost never occurs in the government's rhetoric. Putin has referred to him on several occasions, but only to criticize his policies. Ideologically incompatible sculptured symbols are not unusual. Old monuments often remain in place after political upheavals, such as revolutions or liberations. What is peculiar about Russia is that the frenzied monument building sponsored by the state has produced a hodgepodge of symbols, but has been fairly meaningless from the nation building perspective. To illustrate this point, let us look at the impact of this monument frenzy on the Russian national pantheon of heroes, the one that exists in people's hearts and minds. Now, how do we know what's in people's hearts and minds? One instrument that can be used to this end is public opinion polls, asking people about significant historical figures. Levada Center has asked this question, and before that, was a different name. It's a long story. It's always been an open question. The respondents named their own figures. So here are the results from the year 1989. Almost the last year before the collapse of the Soviet Union, in 1999. So I picked the top 10 from a list that is actually, of course, longer. Now, in 1989, the pantheon is mostly Soviet, and those figures who belonged in the Soviet pantheon are marked in red over there. It came at the peak of Gorbachev's perestroika, marked by a broad ideological ferment in the Russian society. Not every name in the list is Russian. Marx and Engels, of course, also are the remains of Soviet ideological legacy, just as other figures on the list. Lenin is still at the top, as you see, but there is no Stalin on the list. Now, ZHUKOV is there, even though, of course, there were no statues to ZHUKOV at that point. Now, if we look at the same poll asking people the same question in 1999, you will see that it is actually also essentially Soviet. All those figures who were members of the Soviet pantheon are again marked in red. Stalin now looms fairly large. Whether Stalin was a member of the Soviet pantheon is an interesting question, but apparently it was not a member of the pantheon as reflected in the statutes of those days. And that was still the period when the state, the government, the Communist Party was the mastermind and was the guardian of the pantheon. So Stalin is new in this sense. Now, let us now look at two more lists. The one from 2017 and the one from 2021. I was very lucky. Levada Center published its latest results of its latest poll literally a few days ago. So as you can see, the list is still essentially Soviet. One new figure that appeared on the list is Putin himself, appeared there for the first time in 2003. Stalin remains steady at the top. As I showed you, Stalin already was there in 1999, but he became, for the first time, he figured as #1 in 2012. So still no state-sponsored statues to Stalin, still no official glorification. Now, Putin, as you see, went down in 2021 compared to 2017 quite significantly. Brezhnev rose to the top 10, not that he was totally absent, but he was much lower than in 2021. Einstein climbed up, also was there on the list before, but neither, of course, are post-Soviet figures. Neither has to do with today's post-communist Russia, post-Soviet Russia. I'd also point out that the overall number of votes cast for the top 10 national figures, and you see these numbers after every name, and also in the end in brackets. So the overall number of votes has declined quite significantly, and especially in 2021. So fewer people readily come up with names of national heroes today. Let's go back a little bit so you can see those numbers, right? 273 in 89, 270, basically the same in 1999. And then 233 votes cast for the top 10 in 2017, and a mere 178 at the height of the government campaign of commemoration in stone. So despite the monument frenzy and more generally, despite much more intense operation of the government in the ideological sphere, we have fewer votes cast for any figures whatsoever. Also, despite the frenzied monument commemoration of the czars, saints, princes, and others, none of them has made it to the top of the Russian pantheon that still remains essentially Soviet today. Probably not unexpectedly, given what I mentioned earlier, the absence of distinct narratives and other forms of commemoration that would accompany the erection of monuments to historical figures. What is especially noteworthy, of course, is that Stalin remains a steady #1, despite the absence of state-sponsored commemoration. The government has been for years engaged in intense monumental commemoration or monumental propaganda, but the historical figure universally regarded as the #1 member of the national pantheon does not have any state-sponsored statues dedicated to him. Now, this is a peculiar and I would say unsteady situation. It seems that either of the two things should happen in the future. Either Stalin's image would gradually fade away from people's memory and somebody else would move to the top position. Who that should be is currently fully unclear. Or the state will eventually recapture the initiative and start building its own new Stalin statues. At this point in time, I would say the latter appears, unfortunately, more likely. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Masha. And in a certain way, Fukuyama can turn to be right about the end of history, but not in the way he meant it, because the lack of the historical narrative creates a situation in which the government basically is creating a monuments a la carte. We are doing monuments for every Tsar and for every historical figure, and it's up to you to decide whom you are going to like. But I do believe this is a very interesting way to start our conversation. So please, being not many has advantages. So feel very much welcome to ask questions, to comment on what Masha was saying. Yeah.
Thank you. Maria, it was such a great talk, and I kept taking notes, and I found quite a lot of things interesting from my own perspective as an art historian. So this will be a bit of a comment, and I'm interested to hear how you would react to it. I never thought about it before, but I thought it's interesting from the way that you spoke and this historical overview, how you think of the notion of monumental propaganda. Because I think as an art historian, I think that one of the things that comes across is that monumental propaganda at the time of Lenin, was quite successful. Now it's not successful. And I think that this basically poses the question, if you can have monumental propaganda or any sort of propaganda only through images and symbols, visual symbols, without stories that are largely told through texts. Art historians always like to think that you can do all these things an image can do, what a text can do. But I wonder if this is the case. And I think that what you told us basically brings across the idea that in order to have monumental propaganda, you need to have a story partly told through text. This is one thing. I don't have an answer to that. I'm just saying that I think it's an interesting question. And the other thing is, I don't know that much about the situation now, but I think that at the time of Lenin's plan for monumental propaganda, there were two things that were going on. The more obvious one was this physical destruction of monuments, and they're being replaced with other ones. But I think that in a way, what is more interesting was those monuments and, let's say, especially religious works of art that were being kept on purpose, but their meaning was destroyed, because then iconoclasm starts meaning something a bit different and more interesting from my perspective, because it's not so much about physical destruction, it's about a destruction of meaning. For example, when you have a consistent cultural policy of taking icons out of monasteries and putting them in museums, you're physically preserving them. Actually, Soviet conservation science was very advanced at the time, but you're clearly destroying their meaning at the same time. So these are not questions, it's just things which are ideas that are interesting for me, and I think they have to do more with art historical issues.
The idea is to get, because my idea is, if we want to get everybody who is interested to ask and so on, at least the first time, because I also have one question, and my question is the following: why? Why there is no narrative? Why even the state that basically, particularly after Crimea, was trying to come with the narrative? And this is my kind of suggestion to see to what extent basically you're going to find it valid, is the following. There was a super task for the Putin's regime, and this is to reconstruct the unity of the Russian history. So everything should be integrated. Soviet period, the Russian period. One of the most interesting monuments that he has opened was the monument of the late Russian Prime Minister, Evgeny Primakov. So the story was that Putin was put there in order not to allow Primakov to become a president of Russia. And from this point of view is, when you're playing the unity, you cannot be iconoclastic and you cannot basically produce a narrative, because for you, everything that was a Russian state cannot be criticized. And I do believe, paradoxically, probably this is the weakness of an ideology that is glorifying the state, nevertheless, whose state it is. Everybody who was on the top of the state is worse. So this is going to be my kind of interpretation, but please.
I think I actually have enough for now.
Yeah,
possible. So I'd probably begin with your question because, of course, this was the question I was asking myself when I was working on this project of monuments. Why no narrative? Putin was extremely concerned about the divisions, ideological divisions in Russia, among the Russian people, since his Millennium Manifesto that he published in late 1999, he was permanently talking about how dangerous, how unhealthy for the nation are the divisions. And of course, the divisions came to the fore during very late 80s and of course during 1990s when various parties tried to prove their own truth when Russia had, okay, let's say liberal government, anyway, Yeltsin's government, but there was a very powerful opposition. I would recall that Yeltsin had a very powerful communist opposition in the Duma. So Putin's task, as he put it, and he repeated it so many times, was we need unity. And that was his refrain that he talked about off and on and again and again. However, actually his tactics or his strategy for ensuring unity was not by actually reconciliation, a word that he was using, reconciliation for the sake of unity, that would take actually something new, a new vision. His policy or his strategy was actually pacification for the sake of acquiescence, which is a totally different project. So instead of offering something that would bring the nation together, he tried to pacify or marginalize the existing differences. And nowhere was it more evident than in 2017 during the celebration or commemoration, actually celebration is probably a wrong word, of the centenary of the Russian Bolshevik Revolution. Because at that point, there were parties, there were mnemonic or ideological entrepreneurs who had very definitive message. The church was mourning the Bolshevik Revolution as a tragedy. The Russian Communist Party and their supporters were celebrating it as the greatest event in the history of humankind. The Kremlin had no message. The Kremlin refrained. That was actually pacification for the sake of acquiescence. Don't aggravate differences. This is why the episode with Dzerzinsky statue is so important to me. So once it came to the fore, it immediately produces problems. In fact, in time for the 2017, in time for the centenary of the Russian Revolution, the authorities had an idea of erecting a statue of reconciliation in Crimea. And there was even a plan, there was even a drawing done by an artist of this reconciliation, whatever, symbolic statue. The passions were running so high, and actually there was even a group of people in Crimea who said that they would sue against the idea of erecting a reconciliation statue. So the passions ran so high that the government actually refrained from the initiative. The statue was erected, in fact, quite recently, but the government had to refrain from this idea. So this is why Putin's strategy has been to allow various actors to the extent that they were generally liberal, generally loyal to the Kremlin, to allow them to express themselves, yet so that it would not urge unwanted passions. That's and this is why there is no narrative. There is no narrative that would actually lead Russia to toward nation building on this new ground. And if this is, since this is the case, even Peter the Great, Peter the Great, of course, if you have a narrative, if you have more than just Peter the Great is the greatest Russian Tsar, then what do you do with the fact that Peter the Great was a Westernizer, and actually belittled himself and his country vis-a-vis the West. What kind of message is that? And yet Putin says he is his favorite czar. And on it goes, and whatever symbol you take. This makes the Kremlin, Putin's message intentionally vague and blurred and uncertain. There is one exception, and this is not to say that the government engagement in the ideological realm is fully inefficient. And of course, the obvious exception is World War II. As I mentioned, the World War II narrative is regulated by a ever-growing number of history laws. So the narrative is reduced to what is possible to say and what is not possible. One is no longer allowed to say. And in fact, this is reflected in the public opinion polls. There is data, again, from Levada Center asking people questions such as, who is responsible for the gigantic losses of the Soviet Union in the war? Answers, in this case, this is not an open question. There is a number of answers offered to the respondents. The top three has just the enemy, just the Germans. Number two is Stalin. Is Stalin to blame for this gigantic number of casualties in the war? And the Communist Party. Then there are other answers as well. And if we look at the dynamics of the answers, the proportion of Russian people who believe it is only the enemy is to blame for gigantic losses, it has grown in a matter of just 4 years from 28 to 47%, just the Germans. Stalin was held responsible in the years that I'm looking at is 2012 to 2016, 30 to 21. Communist Party 20 to 10. Actually, all kinds of issues that have to do with the war demonstrate that actually propaganda works. And now I get to Klimena, your question about propaganda and whether it is monumental propaganda is not enough. Of course, it was very different during the Soviet period, especially the early Soviet period, when it was heavily centralized, when there was just one way broadcasting, mostly radio and newspapers, before the internet, even before television. So the right way of thinking was channeled from top downward through, as we know, permeating system of the Communist Party and the general educational project of the Soviet Union. So it was so different from today, as different as can be, and it worked. Of course, it was a combination of monumental propaganda. There's only as many statues as you can erect, and the narrative, and the school curriculum that was uniform, universally across the country, and of course the Communist Party that presided over history and over everything that the Soviet people were to know and how they were to interpret the world, especially in the early period, especially, of course, after the revolution. This actually raises the question of why monumental propaganda today. I don't think people in the Kremlin do not understand that there are people there who do not understand the difference between the efficiency of the monumental propaganda in like 1920s, 1930s and today. Well, I think that the idea that the government needs to somehow inculcate correct ideas was there. The importance of monumental propaganda was something that, or monumental commemoration, that I think was easy to sell to the establishment and to Putin personally as a Soviet man, as an essentially Soviet man. I think his own pantheon, I think, is very similar to that of his own people. And once this supply was there, there was demand. I think that was the mechanism, and not we shouldn't actually ignore the lucre, the factor of profit making. It's an extremely lucrative project for the military historical society and for the sculptors involved. And there are favorite sculptors there who live off government orders and actually prosper because of that. So once the government bought it, it is there to stay. And this is why 250 statues erected today. I don't think we need actually to explain why monumental propaganda worked better, or whether monumental propaganda alone can work without an accompanying narrative. I think it is an essentially outdated manner of inculcating any concepts, any ideas, any notions of national history upon the people. But I think we actually know the secret. The government wanted, ideology to be there, wanted to ensure loyalty, to ensure the correct vision, to rule out unwanted ideas. And here were those who were happy to offer their services, and the government bought them. And now the momentum is there. I don't think we will see actually a decrease of the activity of the military historical society.
Yeah, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this presentation. I need to say that I enjoy it really very, very much. And I hope that it's going to be published soon in form of a book or an article. It was really great. So I have two questions, or two sets of questions, which are going a little bit into different directions. So one, we would call it like empirical. So I would like to zoom in into particular parts of your presentation, and then maybe more theoretical. So we will zoom out a little bit. So now I'm like zoom in. So I have like two questions here, because I noticed in your presentation that you focus largely on persons, like the commemorations of particular persons from the history, with some kind of references also to the Great Patriotic War. But I was like wondering whether, if you think about this historically, whether there are actually moments towards thinking more like commemorating more events rather than persons. So there are this kind of visions of history as, more eventful kind of collective history, and then, maybe more towards the persons, commemorating the persons, and especially about the socialist period. And then I would be like super interested in knowing, especially about the Great Patriotic War, whether there are really kind of waves of, commemoration and then of kind of silence of the event. And then I have also, when it comes to the empirical material, I would have a question about the contemporary landscape, because I was like wondering, because I'm not sure whether I get it correctly, like who initiates those monuments right now and who finance them, because you mentioned the Russian Military Historic Society as the key player, but I was like wondering whether officially it's like a government, like a state body, or whether it's like a non-governmental organization but works as a proxy for the state, or maybe we have some kind of local initiatives which kind of mimic like what like people think that the state wants to be commemorated. So I was like wondering about this. And now the second question, which is a little bit about the zoom out, which I think that is very, very kind of puzzling. Because when I was like listening to your presentation, I kind of keep thinking about Eastern Europe in general, that actually what is happening in Russia to some extent is very much visible like across the region. So I was studying Ukrainian history a little bit. So this is precisely the history, like each empire, each nation state, it kind of brings their own monuments, their own vision of collective memory, their own kind of vision of history. And then I was thinking, so if we like zoom out even more, like what is the larger lesson from Eastern Europe to be learned about this relationship between material culture, collective memory, national identity. And I've kind of, kept thinking about the demolition of the Confederate monuments in the States, like when this was like all happening, and I kind of, I was observing like Eastern European intellectuals who are like, this is really not new. What is happening? It's kind of obvious for us. So I was kind of, and I was kind of keep wondering, like, what is maybe the larger lesson that we can learn from Eastern Europe, that we can understand maybe, other places there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I think this is enough for another presentation. Now, to your question about events, there is by far, a single most important event, and that is not just the Great Patriotic War, but the victory in the war. This is the event that has been commemorated and glorified, and as I mentioned, for the first year when it was done big time was 1965, and since then I think that these celebrations have become grander under Brezhnev, and even under Yeltsin. We had grand celebrations, especially 1995, another important anniversary, 50 years since the victory, and of course under Putin, this has gained immense proportions, and a lot has been written about it. So on the one hand, there is a narrative, and there is a narrative that is all over the place. It is indeed ubiquitous, just as are the statues. However, even that narrative, of course, is by necessity reduced. Well, every narrative is reduced when it becomes a public narrative, but there are things that are inappropriate and increasingly not even inappropriate, but punishable by law. As I mentioned, the number of history laws are growing and growing. So we're not talking about what preceded the Great Patriotic War, the obvious events prior to 1941. And of course, we're not talking about what happened afterwards, Russia's dominance in Eastern Europe, and of course, quite a few things during the war that were not attractive, that were not about great feats, etc., are basically increasingly prohibited by the history laws. So talking about other events, well, in time for important dates, 100 years here, 200 years there, of course, there are celebrations, and of course, there are new monuments erected. One example is, of course, the years 2014 to 2018. There were commemorations of the First World War all over Europe. And we had them in Russia as well. And Putin even said, well, somehow, surprise, surprise, World War I is not celebrated as it should be. We should celebrate World War I. And of course, sure enough, there was a monument erected in the same park in Poklonная Gora that is dedicated to the Second World War. There is now a monument to the soldier, First World War soldier. But end of story. Nobody knows anything about World War I in Russia. And same goes for most other events. Well, there are things that people would remember about, like, of course, 1812, the Patriotic War against Napoleon. People will remember that. I would say probably more because of literature, because of War and Peace, and of course film, etc., than because of any monuments. But there is one event. There is one event that actually has performed the role of bringing the nation together, and it does bring the nation together. As I said, this has been an ideological exercise or practice that has been quite successful. Not accidental, because it was glorified and it was universally shared in the Soviet decades, post-war decades, especially since 1965, and through Yeltsin's years. Uncomfortable and convenient facts were raised and discussed in 1990s, but this is exactly, or late 1980s actually, but this is exactly what Putin wanted to put an end to, and he did. So I would say mostly there is this one event. All others are way, way inferior in significance and recognition in people's knowledge to the victory in World War II. Now, who initiates? Excellent question. Thank you so much for that. Now, Military Historical Society was founded as a non-government organization, as one would say non-profit, which is actually laughable, but it was initiated under the auspices of the government. On its board is a number of the highest ranking Russian officials. It is understandable to anyone who's interested that in fact, it is a government organization for all practical purposes, even if formally in its structure, organizational structure, it is not. And of course, since this is the case, no wealthy businessman, no billionaire in Russia would ever say no if the Military Historical Society asks for a donation. And I think they don't even have to ask for it. I think wealthy billionaires are quite willing, because this is a way to curry favor with the Kremlin, to donate money. So this explains lucrative projects to the sculptors, etc. It is not only the Military Historical Society. There are also actors. Well, locally, there are actors that may be still considered private initiatives or initiatives of local authorities. But there are actors who have the opportunity and use it to have their own ideas implemented in the streets of Moscow. And I will just mention one, and this is Kalashnikov, the designer of the submachine gun. An exceptionally ugly statue erected in a very busy street, well, not exactly downtown, but not too far. It was erected on the initiative of a very large government company, government corporation, and maybe it's hid. But this is a rare case of an actor like that. It takes to be just so important to have the opportunity to adorn in Moscow street with a statue of a man whose name is associated with a lethal weapon used all over the world. Well, all over the world where people wage wars used to kill people. And to your last question about Eastern Europe, well, Eastern Europe, of course, is very different. And I mentioned that. And Eastern Europe falls in the same category of iconoclasms rather than monument fever. Ukraine, that as far as I understand you're interested in, is an example. I mentioned that out of 5,500 Lenin's, they only have 350 left. So Lenin apart, Lenin fall, like falling leaves, is what it is referred to. Interestingly, they have this Lenin apart as a manifestation of their hostility, their animosity towards Russia, which is kind of ironic given Lenin's role actually in early Ukrainian history. So the idea clearly is nationalist, not anti-communist. Well, the Confederate statues are a very interesting example. I don't have the time to look into it. I think we need to finish. But to us in Russia, to those who are interested in these issues, it was indeed very ironic that Americans are engaged in this iconoclasm, announcing with a with full self-righteousness that these monuments do not belong in public places because they are morally reprehensible, period. As if, they were the first people in the history of humankind to face this question. What do we do with the statues of the past? Time flows, ideas change. What was totally acceptable becomes unacceptable or even reprehensible. and making judgment from today's perspective is something that is extremely naive, I think. And that was the way it looked to me back then. And as you know, it is not just Confederate statues. It is anyone who is besmirched himself by owning slaves, right? Which immediately comes to Washington and the very founding fathers of the United States. Anyway, I think this is very naive. And I think making judgments about the past from a moral standpoint of today is something that, to me, is extremely superficial. And it's not just that this is our history and it should remain there. It's just that this idea that we can judge the past and our judgment is the final, and nobody will come after us. To finish up, just very last thing, I think the very idea of monumental commemoration is a bit outdated, especially mounted statues that appeared in Russia in various places. Sculpture that adorns cities and towns these days tend to be more of artistic quality, not figurative. So this kind of commemoration, I think, is in itself outdated, just as the strategy of glorifying a nation by remembering past military victories, which is also, in my view, a kind of archaic practice. Thank you.
Masha, there are two people that want to join and we should give them possibility.
Of course, yeah.
First is Andrei or Irina, I don't know who of you is interested. And then Tanya Zurchenko is also interested to ask a question. We have 10 minutes, so please.
Yeah, thank you. Masha, first of all, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. Just absolutely fantastic. My question is about the North Caucasus, and you are saying that the concept of the Kremlin is to avoid raising tensions when they are erecting new monuments. So why is that we are getting more and more monuments to, say, Russian generals and Russian soldiers who fought in the Caucasian War in the 19th century? Because obviously, like Yermolov, we got 3 monuments to Yermolov. And the second question, it's a very short question, is I just do not know, maybe you know, do we have any monuments to, say, military heroes of the Russian First and Second Chechen War? Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Tanya, let's get also Tanya and you're going to have, Tanya.
Thank you, Ivan. And Maria, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation, and it was a pleasure listening to you. There was so many ways actually one can continue this conversation. I have a couple of questions, and one of them actually refers to your last statement in your presentation about Stalin monuments. I actually think that the Russian government kind of outsourced the Stalin monuments, constructing these monuments to the Communist Party, because Communist Party is a kind of partner in this project, and the government, Putin, does not himself has to get dirty with this, you know. But my question actually is do you think there is a kind of correlation between this national pantheon, the rating of the historical figures you showed us, and the actual proliferation of certain monuments? Because if you ask people who voted for Stalin as a great figure, actually, most of them would probably say, we don't need the monument to Stalin, we need to raise pensions or something like that, yeah? So my point is actually, does it really come from like a popular like mood or popular opinion, this urge to build certain monuments? Or rather, these are maybe initiatives of various actors, local elites, maybe, who want to brand themselves or their regions in certain way? And then the second question is, how these new monuments are actually integrated into public rituals or ceremonies, because I think in this what makes like post-Soviet situation different from the early Soviet, and that's why actually this monumental propaganda does not work in the same way, because they are constructed and immediately forgotten very often, yeah, and they are not kind of integrated into everyday use, so that they continue to live in everyday life. And the third question would be interesting, what you think about construction of monuments by Russian state and para-state actors beyond the borders of Russia. So there are many examples when Russian, I don't know, sculptors, politicians and so on donate monuments to other countries and cities. And for example, Serbia is, I think, is a very interesting case. You will find a lot of Russian monuments there. So what is the function of this kind of trade with monuments?
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, very good to see you all. So I will try to be very brief. I'm afraid we are out of time. On the rising tensions, true, I think, and this only proves my point. I think some of the government initiatives or the initiatives of para-state actors sometimes raise tensions. And this is not what the government wants. And this is how this reconciliation statute project was wrapped up, because the government did not want the passions. They did not want for there to be litigation over whether or not, I think I didn't mention that, the reconciliation was supposed to be between Reds and Whites in the Civil War. Such examples are actually a few, and not necessarily have to do with monuments. When a divisive issue somehow comes to the fore, it may raise tensions. The government doesn't care about whether liberals are unhappy, and it has many different ways to make the liberals unhappy and worse. But tensions among actors who can be referred to as conservative and who are generally loyal, the government is concerned about it. And for instance, the Russian Orthodox Church versus the Communist Party. They get along very well together, and the patriarch may shake hands or whatever they do, kiss, Zyuganov and the patriarch may kiss each other, but they are symbolic, the symbols that are important to each of these two parties are quite different, and the government tries for these differences not to come to the fore too much. The DZERZHINSKY statue episode was one, and in the end, we have nothing there. I think what might happen in Lubyanka Square is Alexander Nevsky eventually, but we'll see. We'll see how it goes. Chechnya, I think, I don't know, but I think there might be private, of course, just like after the statues to the soldiers killed in Afghanistan. I think it might appear here and there, but not under the auspices of the government. The government doesn't like to actually attract the attention to the casualties. Now, Tanya, I would disagree that Putin outsources Stalin to the Communist Party. I think that at least for now, Putin doesn't want Stalin to become an open nationwide cult. And I think we have many instances, and Putin actually tries to avoid even mentioning him by name. He does, but very rarely. And again, this is one of those divisive issues. The Russian Orthodox Church will not be happy. And Putin has to is concerned about both the Russian Orthodox Church and the Communist Party of the Russian Federation to be both happy, and there are other actors. So this is a divisive issue, and as long as it remains divisive, I don't think Putin would want it to come to the fore big time. This is why Stalin remains in many ways an invisible hero. And this is, I think, a conscious policy of the Kremlin and maybe Putin personally. Do people want Stalin statues? I'm afraid so. Yeah, I think if people were asked, do you want a Stalin statue? Does Stalin deserve to have a statue? I'm afraid the answer will be yes, shared by I don't know, but we've had polls to this effect about Dzerdzhinsky, and I'm sorry to say there is quite a constituency in Russia who would want Dzerdzhinsky back or somewhere. I think same goes for Stalin, and it doesn't get in the way. We want higher pensions and we want Stalin, and actually if we had Stalin still, we'd have higher pensions. I think there may be this kind of reasoning. Well, of course, the statues in themselves do not work. This was what Clemena was asking. This is different. Well, we live in this information age, information society. Statue cannot do this, but I would say that locally there are statues that actually people feel endeared to. There are many examples. I don't have the time to go into it, but I looked into it, and then Yekaterinburg is one example. They have their favorite statues that people actually like, love, would recognize, they will be meeting places. They will say, well, let's meet there near this. There's especially one statue in Yekaterinburg to a painter. That is actually very nice aesthetically as well. Beyond Russian borders, I think this is basically the same as with other things. There are constituencies that actually are grateful to Russia's protection, support, financial, symbolic, otherwise, whether these constituencies actually have enough power or public weight to I don't know, to campaign for a statue and to have a statue erected on Russia's initiative and Russian money, which is very important. I think they emerge. And I think this is, of course, the state with Serbia. I have to be brief. Sorry about that, but thank you for your excellent questions.
Thank you very much. And really very grateful. It was very interesting. I was thinking, because you started with the idea of conservative. Probably this is what is the conservative monumental propaganda in general. Because the American story is just the opposite. You have a very strong narrative about slavery. And the narratives are destroying structures because you're treating every historical figure as a contemporary.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have the conservatives who basically said, nobody have the right to make a moral statements on the people who are not alive. So from this point of view, probably this is how the true conservative monumental propaganda looks like. Different statutes. And the only thing which is important is who do not have a statute, not who has. So thank you so much. Very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you, Ivan.